Thank you so much, Jackie, and I want to thank all of you for coming out on a rainy Halloween for this, what I hope will be a conversation. I wanted to get out from behind the podium and just spend some time sharing some thoughts with you this afternoon, and then really opening it up for dialogue, not just Q&A for me, but if you want to be and are inspired to respond to one another as well. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and part of this festival. This is my first time at the Chicago Humanities Festival. It is not my first time to Chicago, and I have to tell you, as a person who grew up in the New York area, who lives now in Seattle, I dig it here. This is a great, great place, and this festival is a great instantiation of the energy and the ambition of this community, which, to me, just the sheer scale and depth and diversity of the programming that this festival has put on is amazing. I'm very honored and proud to be part of it, and really grateful to you for coming. One of the things that I think is so remarkable as a Seattleite by way of New York coming to Chicago is bringing what I suppose one can think of as the immigrant's eye to this town. I'm an immigrant to Chicago. I know some people here. I kind of know roughly where we are in the city, but I'm otherwise pretty lost here, right? And the idea of being a newcomer to a place, being a newcomer to a community, and trying to figure out your way forward, trying to navigate not only a map, but trying in the first place to divine and to discern a map where one doesn't exist in your mind or your heart about the nature of a community, is the immigrant's lot. And the beautiful and powerful thing about the Chicago Humanities Festival is that it is working to bring that immigrant's eye to all of you who are not immigrants, who are natives of this place, who are residents of this community, but can learn to see one another with perhaps slightly different eyes, with slightly more open hearts and open minds. And I think that's so fitting, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is this notion of what it means to be not only a newcomer, but fundamentally what it means to be a citizen. The theme of this year's festival, Citizens, is one that the word itself is one that some people just completely look past and don't think about particularly. And for others, it's a word fraught with meaning, with political import, with life-changing import. And what I would like to do today is really unpack in 3 different ways the meaning of citizenship. I want to look at it in the first place through a lens of documentation, secondly through a lens of participation, and then finally through a lens of imagination. And before I dive into each of those 3 pieces, let me just tell you a little bit about how I come to this work. I am an immigrant to Chicago, I suppose, but I am the son of immigrants to the United States. My parents were born in China, came here via Taiwan to the United States, and I grew up second generation. And I think for those of you who might be second generation, children of immigrants, you'll know what I mean, that when you are in that position, born in the United States to parents who were not born in the United States, you have this heightened consciousness of everything. You have a heightened consciousness of the kinds of cultural and civic and political literacy that is required to navigate your way in the society. You have a heightened awareness as well of the creed, the idea of America that draws so many immigrants here to these shores, but that, again, so many people who had the dumb luck to be born in this country take for granted. I had the dumb luck to be born here, but my parents didn't. And so I was always, from childhood, one of those people who took quite seriously the creed of American life, who took quite seriously the words and the ideals in our founding documents in our charter, and took quite seriously the unavoidable and mistakable gap between those ideals of that creed and our lived reality as Americans. And moreover, I took quite seriously my responsibility then as a second-generation inheritor of that creed, my responsibility to try to close that gap, try to ensure that this country actually does live up a little bit more every day, a little bit more every year to its stated creed. And so I've worked in politics, I've worked in government. In my life in Seattle, where I've been for the last 15 years, I've been a very active participant in civic life. But to me, one of the most important ways to express this second-generation obligation is to make sure that whatever opportunity you have gets converted into an obligation to be a non-hoarder. I've had incredible opportunities to learn, to experience things, to engage, to work at the White House, to encounter people from all over the United States, all different walks of life. And one of the most basic responsibilities of being second generation is to not keep that to myself, to be a non-hoarder. And so one of the ways in which I've decided to be a non-hoarder is to create this organization, Citizen University. All of our work is about democratizing understanding of how power works in civic life in the United States. Democratizing with communities of all different kinds, with immigrant communities, with veterans who are reintegrating into civilian life, with educators, with technologists, with culture makers, with all different kinds of communities, trying to spread understanding of the stuff that some small layer in any community at every fractal scale, whether it's a city like Chicago or a state like Illinois or the United States, that some small layer knows about, which is, how do you get stuff done? How do you get what you want? How do you ensure that decisions go your way? How do you influence the flow and the form of public and private debates about things? People aren't born knowing how to do these things, and we've created Citizen University as a nonprofit in order to help spread the understanding of these things. And so I just wanted to give you that word of context about the work that I do and the reasons why I think about citizenship the way I do. So let me dive in now to these three lenses, these three ways of seeing citizenship. The first, as I say, is a notion of documentation. Membership in a legal status. So this is the most literal notion of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Do you have the papers? Under the immigration and naturalization laws of the United States, are you a citizen? Are you documented, or are you undocumented? That line between documented and undocumented is a very prominent and controversial line today in our politics, in our immigration debates. But one of the things that we can very easily forget with a foreshortened historical memory is that that line is of only relatively recent provenance. That for most of this country's history, for most of the period when this city became a great city, there was no such thing as documented or undocumented. There were people who came here. They were Irish, they were Italian, they were Greek, they were, in some cases, non-European, but for the most part, they were European. And they came here, and they claimed this place. The idea of drawing this line between documented and undocumented was itself a reaction to, starting in the 1920s and going through the 20th century, to the arrival of slightly different kinds of immigrants. Immigrants from Asia, immigrants from Japan and from China, immigrants from other parts of the world. And suddenly it became a notable thing and an important thing in American politics to start drawing these lines between alien and non-alien, between documented and not documented. And so this notion of this particular frame of citizenship, do you have the documents? Though it seems so controversial and so central right now to our political debates around immigration and citizenship generally, I just want to remind you that this is something that only in the last few generations have we elevated to this sacrosanct status. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Documentation does matter. Citizenship of the United States under the law does matter. But I would also point out to you that when we read the Constitution of the United States, there's actually relatively little, surprisingly little said about this word, citizens. It doesn't appear all that often, and when it does appear, it's not particularly explained. In the body of the original Constitution, in the Bill of Rights even, there are references to citizens. Our president must be a citizen of the United States, 35 years or older. In the 14th Amendment, one of the Civil War, so-called Reconstruction amendments, we began to have a more explicit focus on the meaning of citizenship. And indeed, the first clause of that amendment, the Citizenship Clause, all persons born or naturalized in the United States shall be citizens of the United States or of the state wherein they reside, right? That idea of what is now understood as birthright citizenship was an important thing that the 14th Amendment did, and it was a reaction to slavery and the Civil War. That if you were born in the United States, an ex-slave, that was enough to be called a citizen now that the war was over and slavery under the 13th Amendment had been abolished. But even there, in the 14th Amendment, in the Citizenship Clause, it doesn't particularly say what that means. Later in the 14th Amendment, we are told that the privileges and immunities of citizens and citizenship shall not be abridged. But what are those privileges and immunities? What does that mean, the privileges and immunities of citizenship? Well, people have understood this, legal scholars, the Supreme Court have understood this over time to mean the kinds of rights that are encompassed in the Bill of Rights. But I just point this out to say, even in our founding charter, there is a relative dearth of explanation about what this word means. It is distinguished from the word persons. There are some times where the Constitution talks about persons, and sometimes when it talks about citizens. And so it's understood that persons, as in we the people, is the bigger circle, and citizens is a smaller circle. But again, who draws those lines, what those lines mean, and what's allowed inside and outside those lines is not so spelled out. And so what to me is seemingly a matter of law, of documentation, is in the end a matter of our collective judgment, our norms, our sense together as a community about what those lines mean, what that word means. One of the things that I've had the great pleasure to do over the years is to participate in, speak at, and witness many, many naturalization ceremonies here in the United States. I don't know, raise your hand if you have ever been to or been part of such a thing. Okay, so a relatively small number of you. I urge you, if there's one takeaway from today, commit to yourself that sometime between now and the end of this year, you will find a naturalization ceremony in this city, and you will show up and just go to it. They're happening every day in all kinds of places, libraries, courthouses, you name it. Just show up. When you go to one of these things, it's full of Department of Homeland Security bureaucracy and a cheesy bad video and of a country song about America. But at the end of the day, at the core moment of these ceremonies, what happens is something called the roll call of countries. And these immigrants are asked to rise each from their countries, from China, from Cuba, from the Dominican Republic, from France, from Germany, from wherever it might be, Mexico. And they all rise, and once they're all standing, and sometimes it's a small ceremony of 20 people, and sometimes it's a giant public one of hundreds or maybe thousands of people, they are told, the next time you sit down, you will be an American. Well, that is a goosebumps moment that you realize is not just about documentation status, is not just about the law, but is about this larger sense of cultural community that we are committing to and that we are co-authoring. And I'd been to enough of these naturalization ceremonies that I thought, boy, wouldn't it be amazing if we could create something like that kind of shared communal ritual with that kind of power to move people, not just for naturalizing immigrants and new Americans, but for everyone, for all of us. For those of us who, as I say, had the dumb luck to be born in this country, for those of you perhaps whose families have been in the United States for 5, 10 generations and have forgotten perhaps the meaning of citizenship and the content of that citizenship. And so out of that little inspiration, we at Citizen University created a very simple project called Sworn Again America. This ceremony, a little template with readings of what you might think of as civic scripture, the Declaration, Gettysburg, preamble, the Constitution, I Have a Dream, and then a closing little oath, a nonpartisan oath that is about the content of citizenship as a matter of service and contribution and involvement. The way it's written is agnostic as to documentation status. It's agnostic as to many things. It is saying that it closes with the line, wherever my ancestors and I were born, I claim America, and I pledge to live like a citizen. And we created this little ceremony and this little oath and this little template, and we primed the pump with a few partners, giant events around the country, and then we put it out there. And an amazing thing happened in the subsequent year or two is that it has gone viral. People have grabbed onto this little ceremony, this opportunity, this invitation to renew your vows, to reflect, perhaps for the first time, on what it is that those of us who, as a matter of birthright, are citizens, birthed ourselves into. And so now there are sworn-again American ceremonies all over the place, in churches, on campuses, at festivals, at dinner parties, in all these different realms and domains. And I describe this to you for this simple reason, to say that there is this arc of experience and understanding that we together create about the content of our citizenship that may begin with a notion of documentation, but then begins quickly to transcend it. This brings me to the second lens of citizenship then, which is the lens of participation. Membership in a civic community of neighbors. Membership in a group of people who must live together, whether they like each other or not. And this notion of participation, citizenship as participation, is the notion that we use or mean when we say a phrase like, this person is a good citizen. Right? When we say someone is a good citizen, or this organization, this company is a good corporate citizen, we're not saying they're exceptionally good at fulfilling their legal duties or that they have worn their papers in very visible ways. We're saying, as a matter of values, as a matter of ethics, as a matter of being pro-social contributing members to a community, as a matter of being non-sociopaths, they are citizens, right? Well, when we unpack this notion of citizenship, which isn't about documentation status or legal status, but is about a set of, well, I often break it down into this tripartite form of values, systems, and skills. Do you share and do you cultivate the values of being this non-sociopath, this contributor to a wider body? Values of mutuality, reciprocity, service, sharing of sacrifice, contribution, contribution before consumption, service before self. Do you practice these values? Do you live these values? Do you share these values? Do you cultivate these values in others? That's the foundational layer. Then above that is this layer of systems, which is simply literacy in the systems that make the world go round, right? Oftentimes when we talk about civics, a picture pops in our mind of a lesson of how a bill becomes a law, right? And that does describe one particular system, the system of checks and balances and the system of lawmaking that is partly laid out in the Constitution and is now practiced in our legislatures and so forth. But that's only one part of many systems. There's a system called the marketplace. There's the system called family. There's a system called the natural ecosystem, our actual environment. And each of these systems, if we are to be pro-social, contributing, participating citizens, each of these systems demands a certain amount of literacy on our part. It's not just the question of do you understand how a bill becomes a law, but do you understand how a festival like the Chicago Humanities Festival comes to be? Do you understand who makes that happen? How that works? Do you understand how Fourth Presbyterian comes to not only exist, but to thrive and to be sustained over the generations? Do you understand how neighborhoods in this city speak to one another, think of one another either as kin or strangers? Are you literate in these systems? Do you understand how it is that Chicago's financial fortunes ebb and flow with things that go on halfway around the world? Literacy in these systems is not something we're born knowing how to do, but it is something that is elemental to this second notion of citizenship, which is about participation. And one of the great things that I think this moment in time offers all of us is an opportunity truly, rapidly, aggressively to democratize this understanding of values, systems, and skills of citizenship. The skills piece upon that foundation of values and that literacy in systems. The skills piece is simply, do you have command of the nuts and bolts skills of being an effective contributor? Do you know how to organize? Do you know how to stand up and advocate? Do you know how to negotiate? Do you know how to navigate diversity? Do you know how to bring people together? Do you know how to frame arguments? Do you know how to solve problems? Again, we're not born knowing how to do these things. It requires intentional cultivation. And that intentional cultivation happens in gatherings like this. It happens in community and in context. This is why so much of the work that we do at Citizen University, apart from the cultural projects like Sworn Again America, center fundamentally on the question of power. Really trying to spread and disseminate understanding of power. Because when we think about power and what it means to be able to decide or to shape decisions, what it means to be able to ensure that the community does what you would like the community to do, here again, some people have the capacity, the capital, to exercise that kind of power, and some people do not. And the age that we are in right now, and the reason why this moment makes this such a ripe moment for understanding citizenship in this participatory way, is that we live, silver lining ways to say fortunately, but the reality is, sadly, we live in a period of nearly unprecedented inequality and concentration of wealth and opportunity. That's not a partisan or political statement. That is a statement of demographic and economic fact. We are in something like a new Gilded Age. That you see that new Gilded Age on the Gold Coast here in Chicago. You see it in the South Side of Chicago. You see it in Seattle, which is booming today because of tech. You see it in South Seattle and South King County, which is struggling to keep up. You see it in every single community in this country, the widening gap, which is not only an economic gap, but is a civic gap. And the danger that is posed by this radical and severe level of inequality that we are experiencing right now in the United States is that economic inequality begets civic inequality, which then begets more economic inequality, which begets more civic inequality. It is the turning of a vicious, vicious circle. And so the pessimistic way to look at it is that we are in a death spiral of democracy right now. That in this age of plutocracy, in an age where a few people can buy their way to the presidency, where the choice of one super donor to back one horse versus another can send ripple effects throughout an entire presidential campaign, one way to look at it is to say that we are doomed. I don't look at it that way at all. I look at this as the beginning of a golden age of participation. And this is across the left and the right. Whether you're talking about the emergence of the Tea Party, the emergence of Occupy Wall Street, the surge of the $15 now minimum wage movement, the fast food forward strikes that have gone on in this country, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of these bottom-up, unplanned, not centrally orchestrated movements that are arising from the bottom up, from citizens claiming, deciding, in many cases, for the first time, to claim, to express their voice. This contagion of these kinds of bottom-up movements of participation, left, right, and center right now, are to me the beginning of what is going to be a golden age of citizenship, a golden age of citizens reclaiming this democracy. Now, I know that's a hopeful and maybe even to some ears naively hopeful view of things. But the reason why I have this hope is not just simply a predisposition to be optimistic. It is because the nature of my work brings me into contact with all of these people, with the catalysts, with the organizers, with the first-timers, and on every one of these issues. The people who got involved early on in the Tea Party, who have been, whatever your politics or views might be on whether their effect on national politics has been beneficial or harmful, you cannot deny that they have been massively effective at taking popular anger and resentment about bigness, about the riggedness of our game, and they have converted that into organizing power, voice power, electoral power, policymaking power. The same thing is beginning to happen on the left, actually somewhat less effectively in the Tea Party, but it's happening all across the country right now. And this notion of citizenship is really completely agnostic as to documentation status, right? Because one of the most inspiring movements in our country right now in the realm of civic life is the movement of dreamers. And those of you who don't know what I mean when I say dreamers, I mean young, undocumented friends, neighbors, classmates, family members of ours who, had the Congress been able to pass something called the DREAM Act, which would have allowed young people who are undocumented but came to this country as children to find a pathway to citizenship, had that law passed, the DREAM Act passed, they would now be, in the first sense of citizenship, a legal sense, on a pathway to inclusion. But because the DREAM Act has not passed and the Congress has not moved on immigration reform, this generation of young people have decided to step out of the shadows. They've decided to say, we're going to take the risk of naming ourselves. We're going to take the risk of deportation. We're going to take the risk, not alone, not in ones and twos, but in hundreds, in thousands. And we're going to use every tool at our disposal, old-fashioned shoe leather organizing, newfangled social media tools. We're going to use every tool at our disposal to organize as a movement. And this movement of young, undocumented people has changed the immigration debate in this country and has expanded the frame of the possible. Again, you may agree or disagree with their objectives. You may like or not like the fact that they are here and stepping out of the shadows. But you cannot deny that this is an exercise of citizen voice and power being exercised by people who, under the law, are not citizens. And I think this is the key thing to remember when we compare the notion of documentation citizenship with participation citizenship, which is this. There are tons of people in this country, there are tons of people in this city who have the documents but do not live like citizens. And there are tons of people who do not have the documents and do. And that distinction matters. It is not just a word game. It is not just a philosophical debate. We live in an age of participation, in an age where hierarchies are breaking down, where the opportunity to express voice from the bottom up has never been greater, and where, because of social media and other tools, the ability, whether it's here in the United States, whether it was in Tahrir Square, whether it was in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, where all around this country and around this world you are seeing this bottom-up, peer-to-peer organizing happening. This is citizenship in this second sense. But here in the United States, there is a third and super important lens through which to see the meaning of citizenship. And this is the lens of imagination. Membership not in a legal status, membership not in a community of people who must live together, whatever their status, but rather membership in an idea. The idea is the idea of America. When you get right down to it, the Great Seal, our great institutions, the might and force of the United States Armed Forces, the sacrosanct status of our Constitution, all these things evaporate when you realize that America is really nothing more than an idea. It is an idea that is in part laid out in our creedal documents, in what I was calling earlier, in a civic religious sense, our civic scripture. But it's an idea as well that is embedded in our culture, in the texture and the feel and the sounds and the palate and the taste of life in the city. You can't walk around Chicago without feeling and imbibing and breathing the idea that is America. And that idea that is America is an idea that says hybridity is everything. I am, as I said at the outset, somebody who's thought a lot about these questions in the context of race. I am Chinese American. And one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is what that means in the context of the idea that is America, right? And you can break down each piece of the label Chinese American. I am Chinese. I am Chinese American. I'm American. I'm Chinese in the sense that I understand the language. I can speak it somewhat proficiently. I've certainly internalized the cadence and the rhythm and the poetry of Mandarin Chinese. I'm Chinese in the sense that I was steeped in and raised in a household that never quoted Confucius, but had a deeply Confucian ethic of other-mindedness rather than self-mindedness, of obligation, of propriety. I'm Chinese in the sense that, well, genetically, I am Chinese. I am who knows how many thousands of generations of Chinese. But when you get right down to it and look a little bit more closely at it, this notion of Chineseness starts to break down. Beyond language, beyond cuisine, beyond a few cultural markers, what does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean? What is the content of Chineseness? The idea of the dominant ethnic group in China, the Han Chinese, which I am Han, is itself a bit of an invention that was in response to the periods of Chinese history several hundred years ago when Mongols and Manchus and people from the north, barbarians, took over and started to run their own dynasties. And suddenly people who had not been from those places needed a way to call themselves that would distinguish themselves. If that sounds familiar, that is not unlike the birth and the origins of the idea of whiteness. Whiteness is an idea. There is very little genetically that defines whiteness as some essence that has cultural meaning. The idea of whiteness in America, like the idea of Han Chineseness, is invented. It is constructed. And it is constructed in response to perceived threats and constructed in order to justify a certain array and alignment of power. And so that's the Chinese part of me. Well, what does it mean then to be Chinese American? To be Chinese American is to have this fusion, I suppose. And the cliche is always, either caught between two cultures or mixture of two cultures. And yes, that is true. There are all kinds of, again, cliche ways I can describe how we would have Chinese New Year festivals at the local elementary school where I grew up, and there would be some Chinese food there, but what the kids would all gravitate to was the McDonald's hamburgers, right? There are all these kind of different, combination stories. If any of you watch television and follow sitcoms today, there's a great new sitcom on ABC called Fresh Off the Boat, which is about, based loosely on the childhood and life history of the celebrity restaurateur Eddie Huang, who is this very iconoclastic Chinese-American, Taiwanese-American. And that sitcom tells all of these funny clash of cultures stories. But Chinese-American identity itself is an unsatisfying way to think about things because it presumes that there is a part of me that is Chinese and there's a part of me that is American. But what does the American part mean? What does that mean? The reason why I resist slightly the idea that there's a Chinese half of me and an American half of me is that it presumes that the American half of me is as pure as the Chinese half of me. But this is the reality, the idea of America. The noun American is not just not pure, it is the very essence of impurity. American, that label, is the very descriptor of hybridity, the very descriptor of mixture, the very descriptor of mongrelization, as its opponents once sneeringly called it. The word American is about the intermingling of our bloodlines, of our ideas, of our tastes, of our cultural mores. And this notion of hybridity is something that we too often forget to activate. One of the great things that's happened in American civic life when we talk about citizenship over the last 3-4 decades is that America has come, in most regards, to be able to respect, in many cases, to celebrate diversity. So you hear this phrase a lot now, right? Sometimes in businesses, sometimes on campuses, celebrate diversity. Now, compared to 40, 50 years ago, when public life in this country did not even acknowledge diversity, that's progress. But I would submit to you that we should not be celebrating diversity. We should only be celebrating what we do with diversity. Diversity is the mere presence of unlike elements. Hybridity is the activation of those unlike elements into something new. the combination of them, the intermingling of them into something new. And this idea of America gives rise to an idea of citizenship that means that if you are going to be truly a citizen of the United States, you have to temperamentally and practically be committed always to impurity. You have to be suspicious of people who make claims of purity, whether it's ethnic purity. This is the real way to be Asian. This is the real way to be black. This is what real Jews do. You have to be suspicious of ideological purity. This is what true progressives believe. This is what real conservatives believe. And you have to be suspicious of claims of the purity of heart. The idea that anybody who disagrees with me is not just disagreeing with me, but is wholly wrong and should be exterminated. Right? And we can laugh at that because we still have enough left of a civic culture that we all inherited that says that, you know, as much as we may disagree with each other and as much as Occupy folks and Tea Party folks might dislike one another, they're not going to go ISIS on one another. They're not going to capture each other and behead each other and post videos of each other beheading each other. Right? But make no mistake, this notion, this dream of purity is a virus that takes full form in places like the territories controlled now by ISIS, but takes a equally dangerous form in 100 different ways in everyday civic life here in the United States. We are not automatically immune. And our politics today actually says that our immune system is a little bit weak, that we are falling prey more often than we perhaps should to viruses of fundamentalism and purity. And so what it means to be a citizen of the United States and of this country in this third sense that is about imagination means cultivating just that, imagination, a capacity not only to conceive of what is not, but a capacity to conceive of ourselves as something we may not be. A capacity for empathy, a capacity for more than tolerance, a capacity for actual carrying of the burdens and the history of other people. And so again, one of the other dimensions of our time that makes it so interesting and turbulent is not just that you have movements like Black Lives Matter that are forcing questions and debates about policing and criminal justice reform, but that you have people like another one of the speakers here at this festival this week, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who are making large arguments about the need for reparations and opening in a national way a debate about the meaning of reparations for slavery. And many people get very quickly uncomfortable with that debate. But what it means to be a citizen in this third sense that I'm talking about is to have the moral imagination to contemplate what that would look like. To have the moral imagination to sit with one's discomfort about an issue and to go there, to push through that discomfort and go into it. On the flight over here yesterday, I read a remarkable essay in this most recent issue of Smithsonian Magazine, and I would commend it to all of you. It is an essay of history and contemporary journalism about a piece of history that, frankly, I knew very little about. And I know a fair amount about American history. It was about what essentially the author called slavery's trail of tears. We think about the trail of tears when we hear that phrase, about the brutalizing forced march that Andrew Jackson and others led of Native Americans from their homes and places of origin into what would become reservations. But what this essay in the Smithsonian was uncovering and revealing was that in slavery itself, there was a trail of tears. There was a migration that is all but forgotten to American history of slaves from the tobacco states of Virginia and places like that, down to the cotton states, down to Mississippi and Alabama. And that migration was as forced and brutal and now, unfortunately, forgotten in American life as anything else. What does it mean to reckon with our history? What does it mean, as the name of a great organization out there puts it, facing history in ourselves? What does it mean to face history in ourselves? It means to actively cultivate this capacity for imagination, to see ourselves on the other side of this story, to imagine what this country would be like if it did reckon with its past. And not only the brutal and ugly and hidden dark parts of its past, but the forgotten positive parts of its past. Few people know that the very idea of birthright citizenship, which I talked about as being enshrined in the 14th Amendment, was proven and ultimately made part of our constitutional canon by a Chinese American, a guy named Wong Kim Ark, who was a cook born in San Francisco in the 1800s, who, because this was the era of the Chinese exclusion laws, when he went to China to go visit family and tried to come back to the United States, he was barred at the port of entry in San Francisco and told, "You're Chinese, you can't come into the country." And he said, "I was born in the United States." He didn't say this, his lawyer said this. "I was born in the United States. I'm a citizen." And this recently enacted, ratified thing called the 14th Amendment says, if I was born here, I'm a citizen here. And so his case went to court, and it worked its way up to the federal courts. And then finally, in 1898, in the Supreme Court case of Wong Kim Ark versus the United States, the Supreme Court said, basically, we don't love this, but you can't read the Constitution any other way. As the majority opinion put it, to read it any other way would be to deny citizenship to thousands of people of German or Irish or Scottish or English ancestry. And implicitly, that just wouldn't do, right? Couldn't do that. So if you have to let those guys in, you got to let this Chinese cook in and people like him. That's a part of our history that is not told. That is a part of history that is not, where the dots are not connected, right? But what it means to be a citizen of this idea of America and to exercise this imagination is to be willing to actively want to have this more capacious sense of our story, to have a bigger notion of who is us. And so I want to close simply in stitching back together these ideas of documentation and participation and imagination with just a simple story about my father. My father was born, as I say, in China, grew up in his adolescent years in Taiwan, came to the United States at age 18. First job in the United States was helping to paint a yellow line down a little road somewhere in South Dakota. And he became a citizen of the United States in the documentation sense, in the sense of he took the test and he got naturalized, he took the oath, in 1978, when I was 9, going on 10. But he had become a citizen of this country in that second sense and the third sense long before then. He'd been in the country, by the time he got naturalized in 1978, he'd already been in the United States 20 years. And in those 20 years, he'd absorbed every facet of American life. He'd absorbed slang. He'd absorbed political language. He'd absorbed funny things in popular culture. And so that by the time his day of naturalization arrived, and I was old enough, of course, to be aware of what was going on and to understand what it meant when he came back with the little booklets and the American flag, my father had already been for many years a fan of Sugar Ray Leonard, for many years a fan of Rodney Dangerfield, for many years a reader of the newspaper about what was going on in Poughkeepsie, New York, for many years an armchair commentator about presidents and Congress and national politics. He had for many years already claimed this country. And he had begun, in the third sense, in the sense of imagination, to begin to imagine what an America for me might look like. He'd begun to imagine what it might be for I, who was born here, to have the opportunities that he felt mainly he could see, but not quite grasp. And so when I think about my father, and I think about the politics of our time and the ways in which there is this emphasis on purity and fundamentalism and this desire to exclude, not just in our immigration debates, but in everything, I think about the ways in which participation and imagination must every time trump, and I use the word trump, I suppose, somewhat deliberately, must every time trump the documentation notion of citizenship. Participation and imagination trump documentation. And what our job here is today in this conversation, and as you go forth to live in this city and to make this city and to make this country is to think about ways every day, large and small, that you can be somebody who participates and that you can be somebody who helps imagine a bigger story of us. One of the great things about this city, and our friends from the Chicago Community Trust are here, many of you, I suppose, I would bet, were involved in a thing that's now happening every May, the Opentable Project, where people all around the city are invited on the same day simply to come together and organize conversations in circles of a dozen people or less, right? So you got a few months before the next open table in May here, but I would encourage you, every single table you sit at, your dinner table, your conference room table, your staff table, the table at your house of worship, the table at the public library, every table you come to and every table you sit at is an open table for you to practice this kind of citizenship, to think about what it means to embody participation and imagination, and together redefine America. Thank you very much.
Would you be in favor of compulsory voting?
The question was, would I be in favor of compulsory voting? And the answer is yes. I've actually advocated in essays I've written compulsory voting, mandatory voting. Look, I think one of the things that we as Americans have is we have a hugely overdeveloped rights muscle. Drop of a hat, we will talk about our rights, right? And how people don't tread on my rights, right? I'm not just talking Second Amendment rights, I'm talking First Amendment, I'm talking 14th, well, whatever, right? But we have compared to how robust a rights muscle we have a very flimsy, atrophied responsibilities muscle. We don't think and talk so much about the responsibilities of citizenship. And even though the Constitution focuses only on privileges and immunities, I think there is implicit in a small r republic a set of responsibilities that go along with privileges and immunities. And voting, to me, is at the very heart of those responsibilities. And so I think compulsory voting is no more offensive than, in times of war, compulsory draft registration, or in times of peace and war, compulsory jury duty is. My goodness, if we as citizens can be called to serve on juries, we certainly can be called to make the effort to drop a ballot, right? So yeah, I'm all for that. And look, I think that, I know that offends many people's libertarian sensibilities, but there is one of the great historians whose work has shaped a lot of my thinking, a guy named David Hackett Fisher, some of you may have heard of, a professor at Brandeis, I believe, outside of Boston, writes a lot about liberty. And another person who's got more of a Chicago tie, Gary Wills, has a great book, less known than some of his books about Lincoln and the rest, a book called Inventing America. I would commend this book to you by Gary Wills. It's about essentially the philosophical underpinnings of Jefferson's thought as he composed the Declaration of Independence. And what you see when you excavate the work of David Hackett Fisher or Gary Wills, and you get into the kinds of things that people like Jefferson were reading and consuming when they created documents like the Declaration, was that they had a deeply communitarian sense of liberty. Liberty was not just the removal of encumbrance. Liberty, well, properly understood, every right was a duty. Every right came with a duty, right? And over the generations, that notion of liberty and rights has fallen away, and we forget about the duty and the responsibility side, but I think voting is at the heart of that.
The founders had a rather limited notion of to whom the liberty applied. However, if you look at the broad sweep of history, the reality is that this great disparity in wealth is the dominant trend, and that as much as I would like to think we are not reverting back to the mean, I would like to know of vast inequality. What makes you optimistic that we're not in just some anomalous period, and that there will be? I would like to No, I would like to become more optimistic.
One of the things that makes me optimistic that we are not just in that death spiral of inequality and concentration of wealth and voice and opportunity is that we have been, as a country, worried about the death spiral from the very beginning, right? Part of the American idea is an idea that this is a fragile experiment that has more things baked into it that predispose it to collapse than it does have things that predispose it toward perpetuity, right? And so from the founding onward, we have worried about whether the system is cratering and whether it's going to collapse and whether we are going to become Rome, not the Republic, but whether we're going to be the Roman Empire, right? That doesn't give, I don't mean that to sound complacent. I don't mean it to say, hey, we've been worrying about this stuff all the time and we're going to soldier on and keep worrying about it. I do mean that when you compare our civic culture to that of any other country, pretty much, because we are a creedal country, that because there is no notion of Americanness that can be assigned to color, race, religion, we have this kind of perpetual, I think, very healthy insecurity about whether we are living up to our creed, right? That is an American idea. In China, for instance, today, where there are equally vast spreads of inequality, where you have 300 million people who are living like Americans in terms of their standard living, but then another billion who are still very much caught in poverty, you don't have a Chinese idea that says, hey, we're failing to live up to the point and the purpose of our country, and it's intolerable that we should have this level of inequality. That's not being Chinese. People don't talk that way. But they do say that's not being American. It's not American to have this level of inequality. It's not American to have the game so rigged by so few, right? And I think that is, I'm not saying that is ever present. Our history is a history of times where that instinct is dormant and sometimes that instinct is activated. I just see a lot of evidence today that instinct is getting reactivated. And so the second reason why I am optimistic, look, I guess I would say I'm not blindly optimistic. I think it's an open question whether we're going to do it, right? I do believe, though, that back to the hybridity of our culture, one of the things when I think a lot as a Chinese American, I think about the rise of China a lot and the shadow that casts in civic life in the United States. You know, every time an Asian power has risen and made Americans nervous, it hasn't turned out so great for Americans of that Asian ethnicity, right? The internment of Japanese Americans, the treatment of Wen-Ho Lee, there are cases that go to the present day where Asian Americans, during times when Asia is rising, get seen through a particular filter that makes someone who looks like me alien or foreign until proven otherwise. Right? So I'm very attuned to the rise of China, and yet I'm not at all, when I think geopolitically, I'm not worried at all about the rise of China. Maybe someday in the next 6, 8, 10, 12 years, China's GDP will surpass that of the United States, and they'll get to wave the #1 flag, right? And that might be a bit of a psychological blow to some Americans, but even if that day comes, I'm not worried because we retain this deep, enduring competitive advantage, which I put this way. America makes Chinese Americans. China does not make American Chinese. China does not want to, is not interested in, does not have an operating system for taking people from other parts of the planet, at least in theory, welcoming them, and at least in theory, integrating them into civic life to be contributors and to make the whole stronger. In theory, we have that. In theory, that is our operating system, right? But the key is in theory. And so the question really for us in our time is, are we going to blow it or not? Are we going to blow that competitive advantage? And so I'm optimistic because I see a lot of evidence of this emerging generation that is more diverse than any we've seen in this country, finding voice, finding power, claiming it, and helping to shape a new America. But I grant that it's, nothing is foreordained. And so it's about whether people like us show up and convince others to show up.
So in a world with limited resources, is it futile for us to argue for racially or socioeconomically integrated schools, rather than focus on improving high poverty, hyper-segregated schools?
I think, I couldn't quite hear you, but I think the question was, in a world of limited resources, should we be focusing more on integration, racial integration of schools versus simply focusing energy on improving high poverty, racially concentrated schools? Is that roughly what the question was? Okay, I guess I would say it this way. Integration must be our watchword. In every sense. Okay, we're gathered here 50 years post the Civil Rights Act, 50 years post the Voting Rights Act, 50 years post the kind of high watermark of the civil rights movement, right? And our commitment to integration as a matter of law and as a matter of culture is waning. And I'm not just talking about black-white integration. I'm not just talking about integration of public schools. I'm talking about immigrant integration, right? Our commitment to incorporating immigrants into civic life, and not just, hey, learn how to become like the white people who preceded you here, but no, welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival, welcome to the Chicago Public Library, welcome to this public space. How are you going to contribute to it, and do you have an opportunity to put your voice into this? Immigrant integration. I mentioned earlier veteran integration, right? We have a lot of talk in our society about the 99% versus the 1%. I'm going to tell you about the 1% that I think a lot about, the 1% of Americans who have fought and served in the last decade of our country's wars. It is an abomination to me, frankly, that we've only asked 1% of us to do all that fighting and dying and struggling and carrying of our policies out across the world, right? But here they come back now, 1 million a year. And the nature of American life and the narratives of American life is sometimes to see veterans either as heroes who walk on water or charity cases, people with PTSD, homeless vets, right? And yes, those are both part tales of what I would say is a Gaussian bell curve of veterans, but we're forgetting the bulge in that curve, which is people who served because they believed, or maybe they served because they had to, economically, but who in the course of their service learned things, in the course of their service were part of an institution that is one of the few truly integrated institutions in the United States now, and now they're home. And now they are assets waiting to be activated to apply everything they did and learned and experienced consciously and unconsciously in the revitalization of our communities here, right? So integration is an ethic that I think we have to recommit ourselves to 50 years post the movements of 1965. And so when it comes to actual public education, I am absolutely for figuring out how we revive the idea and the practice of meaningful integration. Now, it's a whole other conversation. I know, indeed, the event that preceded us here today was about Chicago public schools. And, you know, you can go deeper into the question of, from the perspective of a school district, are there some highly racially concentrated schools that you should just focus energy on making sure you improve? Yes, there are going to be cases like that, right? And there's a lot of education policy debate to be had there. But, you know, integration matters. And not, let me be very clear, not because it's doing a favor to the people who are kept outside the circle, right? Racial integration is not letting non-whites get the joy and benefit of the company of whites, right? Immigrant integration is not about the joy and the benefits to the immigrants of being in the company of natives, native-born Americans. Veteran integration is not just about civilians bestowing all of their wisdom and goodness on helpless veterans. This is a two-way street. If we mean integration truly, we mean thinking about all these people who are on the outside of the circle and what they can contribute in their voice, in their ideas, in their practice, to make the whole greater, to change the whole, right? And so I think, you know, I guess I would just close on this note, and happy to continue as we do the book signing conversations on this topic or any other. I really want to close with this note that we have a charge. You have a thing you have to do when you leave here, and that is to think about what each of you can do in your circles. And some of your circles are big, and some of your circles are intimate. but every one of you has some capacity to put into practice a simple precept, which is this: society becomes how you behave. If you choose to be compassionate or not compassionate, integrationist or not integrationist, courteous or discourteous, inclusive or non-inclusive, that's not just your choice in the course of a busy day in the big city. What you are doing is you are setting off a contagion. Every one of you is a node of contagion for changing our civic norms and our culture. And that layer of culture precedes everything. It precedes politics. It precedes policymaking. And so if we want a better Washington and we want better politics, we have to begin with that level of a personal, heart-level commitment to this practice of integration and the spirit of citizenship as a matter of participation and imagination, as well as documentation. Thank you very, very much.